At exactly 9:47 in the morning, two brides were getting their makeup finished in two different dressing rooms of the same wedding venue. Two grooms were adjusting their cufflinks in two different suites down the same hallway. And exactly one event coordinator was staring at her tablet with the specific, dawning horror of someone who has just realized a catastrophic mistake that could not, under any circumstances, be quietly fixed before anyone noticed. Sakura Grand Hall, Ballroom, 2 p.m., she read aloud to herself for the third time, as if repeating it might somehow change the words glowing back at her from the screen. It didn't. Two separate wedding parties had booked the exact same venue, the exact same hall at the exact same hour, a scheduling error buried in a software update that had gone unnoticed for 3 full months, discovered only now, on the morning both ceremonies were meant to happen. In dressing room 1, Yui sat perfectly still while a makeup artist finished her final touches, running through her vows in her head for what felt like the 100th time, entirely unaware that the man she was about to marry, a kind, steady, utterly reasonable accountant named Kenji, was not the only groom preparing for a wedding in that building that day. In Suite 3, on the opposite end of the same hallway, Haruto stood in front of his own mirror, adjusting a tie his fiancée, Emi, had picked out for him 3 separate times over the past month, feeling a strange, hollow calm that he had been telling himself for weeks was simply pre-wedding nerves and nothing more complicated than that. Neither of them knew yet that in exactly 2 hours, a scheduling mistake buried in a piece of forgettable software was about to force them into the same hallway, in front of the same nervous florists for the first time in 6 years. This is the story of the wedding that never happened and the one that finally did. 6 years earlier, Yui and Haruto had met on the very first day of university, both hopelessly lost trying to find the same lecture hall in a campus that seemed designed specifically to humiliate anxious 18-year-olds. Haruto, who had memorized the campus map the week before out of sheer nervous energy, ended up guiding a total stranger to the exact same hall he was heading to himself. By the time they sat down, 10 minutes late, and still laughing quietly about it, neither of them had any idea they had just met the person they'd spend the next 3 years falling in love with. What started as sharing lecture notes became sharing lunch tables, which became sharing weekends, which eventually became the specific kind of relationship where neither of them could remember exactly when friend had quietly turned into the person I want to build an entire life with. There was a night market near campus they went to almost every Friday, working through the same 6 food stalls in the same order every single week, arguing affectionately over whether the takoyaki or the grilled skewers were better, a ritual so specific and so entirely that neither of them ever imagined a version of their lives where it simply stopped happening. They talked about the future constantly, the way only 20-year-olds who genuinely believe in forever can. An apartment near the coast. 2 cats, already named before either of them had a job stable enough to actually afford rent. A wedding on a beach instead of some stuffy hall, because neither of them wanted anything traditional or expected. They had it all planned out, down to the smallest, most impractical detail, 3 years before real adult life had any chance to test whether those plans could actually survive contact with it. They weathered plenty of smaller storms along the way. A failed exam that sent Haruto spiraling for a week, a family emergency that pulled Yui away from campus for a devastating month, the ordinary friction of 2 people learning to actually live inside each other's lives instead of just admiring them from a comfortable distance. Every single time, they came out the other side closer, more certain, more convinced that whatever came next, they'd figure it out together. Graduation came, and with it, the first real test of every plan they'd made as students with nothing meaningful to lose. Haruto was offered a position at a respected firm 2 cities away. A genuinely excellent opportunity, the kind neither of them could pretend wasn't worth taking seriously, no matter how inconvenient the timing felt. The night the offer letter arrived, they sat on the floor of his dorm room until nearly 4 in the morning, taking turns being the optimistic one. "It's only 2 hours by train," Yui had said, not quite believing it herself. "People do long distance all the time. We're not people who give up on things." Haruto had agreed, holding her hand a little too tightly, both of them quietly aware that they were making a promise neither of them yet knew how to keep. They tried for exactly 4 months to make the distance work. Weekend visits that ate entire Saturdays in transit. Long phone calls stretching past midnight, both of them too stubborn to admit how tired they'd become. Promises that this was temporary, that one of them would eventually move, that love this deep simply didn't dissolve because of a few 100 kilometers of train track. But 4 months of distance revealed something neither of them wanted to admit out loud, that the relationship they'd built as students, full of spontaneous late nights and endless free time, simply wasn't built to survive the specific, grinding pressure of 2 demanding new careers and a train schedule stretched thin between them. The arguments weren't dramatic, and that somehow made them worse. There was no single betrayal, no unforgivable mistake either of them could point to and blame. It was smaller and sadder than that. A slow accumulation of missed calls, rescheduled visits, and the quiet, mutual exhaustion of trying to maintain something that increasingly felt like an unpaid second job neither of them had the energy left over for. By the 3rd month, the visits that used to feel like reunions started to feel like obligations. Conversations that used to run for hours shrank into 10-minute check-ins squeezed between work commitments. Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them had started, quietly and separately, to dread the sinking feeling of hanging up the phone and immediately wondering what exactly they were fighting so hard to hold on to. The specific moment that broke something between them, though neither called it that at the time, happened on a Saturday in September, when Yui canceled a visit for the 2nd weekend in a row because of a deadline that genuinely couldn't wait. Haruto stood alone at the station for 20 minutes before accepting she truly wasn't coming. And when he called her that night, neither of them fought. They just sat on the phone in a long, heavy silence, both quietly aware that something had shifted from temporary hardship into something that felt considerably more permanent. The breakup, when it finally came, wasn't a fight at all. It was a mutual, exhausted admission on a park bench in October. Both of them crying, both of them agreeing that maybe loving someone deeply wasn't automatically the same thing as being right for each other's futures. Maybe in a different life. Yui had whispered, and Haruto had simply nodded, because neither of them had the energy left to argue with something that felt, in that specific, devastating moment, unbearably true. Yui threw herself into her career the way people often do when they're trying very hard not to think about something else. She became excellent at her job, methodical and reliable, the kind of colleague everyone trusted precisely because she never let anything visibly rattle her, no matter how much rattled quietly underneath the surface. Haruto, for his part, excelled too in the specific, hollow way of someone using long hours to fill a space that used to be occupied by something considerably warmer. There were nights, more of them than he ever admitted to anyone, where he'd open an old message thread with Yui's name at the top and stare at it for several long minutes before closing his phone without typing a single word. Yui did the same thing, on nights she'd never admit to anyone either. Scrolling back through old photographs from the night market, the rooftop, the graduation ceremony, wondering quietly whether 4 months of distance had really been enough reason to give up on something they'd once been so certain about, before reminding herself firmly that some bridges are better left uncrossed. Eventually, both of them met people who made sense on paper, and increasingly, in genuine practice. Yui met Kenji at a mutual friend's dinner party. Steady, kind, endlessly patient, the kind of man who remembered her coffee order after a single conversation and never once made her feel like she was too much, or somehow not quite enough. Haruto met Emi through work, a bright, ambitious marketing director who matched his pace, understood the demands of his schedule, and never once complained about the late nights his job regularly required of him. Both relationships grew steadily and comfortably over the following 2 years, the kind of love that made complete sense on every practical level, even if neither of them examined too closely why it never quite carried the reckless, all-consuming intensity of what they'd had at 20. Kenji proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly the low-key, unpretentious way Yui had always said she preferred. Emi accepted Haruto's proposal on a rooftop overlooking the city, exactly the kind of carefully coordinated moment his co-workers had helped him plan for weeks. Both said yes. Both meant it, as much as either of them understood what meaning it was even supposed to feel like. 6 years into pretending the feeling from their 20s had simply been youthful exaggeration all along. Now, 6 years after that park bench, Yui sat in a dressing room getting ready to marry a genuinely good man, surrounded by bridesmaids fussing over her veil, running through her vows one final time, feeling something she couldn't quite name, sitting quietly beneath the excitement of the morning. Down the hall, in a suite he didn't yet know was directly connected to hers by the same disastrous scheduling error, Haruto stood while his groomsmen joked loudly around him, staring at his own reflection with the specific, hollow stillness of a man trying very hard to convince himself that nervousness and genuine doubt were the exact same feeling wearing different clothes. Meanwhile, in the venue's cramped back office, the coordinator and 3 increasingly panicked staff members were discovering there was simply no elegant way to tell 2 full wedding parties, already fully dressed and half photographed. That ballroom, it could physically host 1 wedding at 2 p.m., not 2. The first attempted solution, quietly relocating Yui's ceremony to a smaller adjacent room without any real explanation, lasted exactly 4 minutes before Yui's mother demanded, loudly and at length, to know why her daughter's carefully planned wedding was suddenly being treated like an inconvenient afterthought. A second, entirely separate solution, quietly suggesting Haruto's ceremony move to the garden terrace instead, was met with almost identical outrage from his own mother, who had specifically chosen the venue for its indoor ballroom acoustics and was not, under any circumstances, prepared to negotiate on that point. By 1:15 p.m., the venue manager had called every available contact in the company's head office, discovering with mounting despair that there was no third ballroom, no available backup space, and no realistic way to physically separate 2 full weddings that had, through nobody's individual fault, been sold the exact same hour the exact same afternoon. What followed was the kind of chaos no wedding planner is ever properly trained for. Both bridal parties, redirected in opposite directions and thoroughly confused, ended up converging in the same central hallway at the exact same moment, florists carrying 2 entirely different flower arrangements past each other in visible frustration. A string quartet meant for ballroom, awkwardly tuning up directly beside a DJ setting up for the same physical space. Two mothers of two different brides both insisting, loudly and simultaneously, that their daughter's wedding was clearly the one that actually mattered. A catering cart, pushed in haste by a waiter trying to salvage the situation, collided directly with a stack of folding chairs meant for the opposite ceremony, sending a tray of champagne glasses sliding across the marble floor in a slow, horrifying cascade that somehow, miraculously, no one actually stepped in. Somewhere behind the chaos, a groomsman could be heard loudly asking whether anyone had actually confirmed which wedding the cake belonged to, a question that was met with only more shouting. Yui, drawn out of her dressing room by the escalating noise echoing down the hallway, stepped out in her full wedding dress to see what on earth was happening, and stopped dead in her tracks. Because at the exact same moment, drawn by the very same commotion, Haruto stepped out of his own suite in a perfectly tailored tuxedo and froze entirely, completely at the sight of the last person on earth he expected to see standing in a wedding dress 10 feet away from him. For one entire, suspended moment, the chaos of the hallway, the arguing mothers, the confused florists, the frantically apologizing coordinator, simply ceased to exist for either of them. There was only the impossible, absurd fact of Yui, in a wedding dress, staring at Haruto, in a tuxedo, 6 years and one catastrophic scheduling error later. Haruto, Yui finally managed, her voice barely audible over the continued chaos surrounding them. Yui. You said her name the way you'd confirm something impossible was actually happening right in front of you. You're getting married. Today. So are you, she said, glancing at his tuxedo, then back up at his face, a disbelieving laugh escaping despite herself. In the same building. At the same time. It took another full 10 seconds and a loud exclamation from the coordinator about the exact same ballroom before the full ridiculous shape of the situation actually landed on either of them. With both ceremonies now delayed by at least 90 minutes while the venue frantically tried to sort out any workable solution, offering one couple a discount, the other a rescheduled reception, neither option remotely satisfying either furious mother. Yui and Haruto found themselves ushered into the same small side room to wait, away from their respective families, ostensibly to stay calm and out of the way, while the actual crisis got resolved elsewhere. For the first several minutes, neither of them said anything at all. What exactly do you say to the person you once planned an entire imaginary life with, sitting 3 feet away from you on the very day you're both marrying somebody else? It was Haruto who finally broke the silence, with the same nervous half-laugh she remembered from 6 years of shared lecture halls. So he said, "Small world." Yui let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and something in the tightly wound tension of the morning finally loosened, just slightly. Ridiculously small, she agreed. What started as awkward small talk about the sheer absurdity of the double booking slowly, inevitably, drifted somewhere else entirely. They talked about the years in between, her career, his career, the apartment she'd finally bought near the coast, the 2 cats he'd actually ended up adopting, almost exactly like the careless plans they'd made as 20-year-olds who genuinely thought forever was a simple, uncomplicated thing to promise someone. "You got the cats," she said quietly, something unreadable threading through her voice. "I did," Haruto admitted. "Somehow ended up exactly where we said we would. Just," he paused, searching for the right way to say it without saying too much. "Just not with the person I originally planned it with." A staff member interrupted briefly to update them on the venue's increasingly desperate attempts at a solution, Something about a possible reception downgrade, a partial refund, logistics neither of them was remotely paying attention to anymore. The moment the door closed again, the conversation simply picked back up exactly where it had left off, as though 6 years apart had barely interrupted it at all. At one point, Haruto made a joke about the string quartet's confused rendition of what was supposed to be his own first dance song, and Yui laughed, really laughed, the kind of sudden, surprised laughter that catches you off guard because you'd forgotten a particular sound existed in you at all. She pressed a hand to her mouth, startled at herself, and Haruto watched her with an expression he quickly tried to smooth back into something more neutral. "You still laugh like that," he said quietly, before he could stop himself. "Like what?" she asked. "Like you're surprised every single time something's actually funny. I used to love that about you." The words hung there for a moment, more honest than either of them had planned on being, and neither of them rushed to take them back. The conversation kept circling back, gently but unmistakably, to the life they'd once mapped out together in careless, hopeful detail. Not with regret, exactly. Neither of them wanted to insult the genuinely good people currently waiting for them down the hall, but with the specific bittersweet recognition of two people who had built almost identical lives, just years apart, and just without each other in them. "Can I ask you something?" Yui said eventually, twisting her engagement ring absently around her finger. "Do you ever wonder if we broke up because we actually weren't right for each other? Or because we were just too young and too scared to figure out how to make the hard parts work?" Haruto was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was actually considering the question rather than deflecting it the way he might have years earlier. "I used to tell myself it was the first one," he finally said. "Easier to believe we just weren't meant to be than to believe we gave up on something that might have actually worked if we just tried a little harder for a little longer." "And now?" Yui asked, barely above a whisper. Haruto looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter than before. "Now I'm honestly not so sure anymore." The admission hung in the small room between them, heavier than either of them expected it to land. Yui didn't respond right away. She didn't entirely trust her own voice not to shake if she tried. "For what it's worth," she finally said, "I used to imagine running into you like this. Not literally like this, obviously. I never once pictured a double-booked wedding venue. But I used to wonder what I'd say if I ever saw you again. And every version I imagined was calmer than this actually feels." Haruto laughed, quietly and genuinely, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "I used to imagine it too," he admitted. "Usually somewhere far more dramatic. A rainstorm, an airport. Never once did I imagine it happening in a hallway with a string quartet playing the wrong song for the wrong wedding. Somewhere down the hall, two entirely separate lives were still waiting for them. A fiancé checking his watch, a fiancé reapplying lipstick, two families completely unaware that the 90-minute delay was quietly becoming something far more complicated than a scheduling error. Almost without deciding to, Yui reached into a small hidden pocket her seamstress had sewn into the lining of her dress. A private joke between her and her bridesmaids about needing somewhere to keep tissues, and pulled out a single, worn photograph she hadn't told anyone she'd brought that morning. It was the two of them, considerably younger, laughing at the night market, taken on a disposable camera neither of them remembered who was holding. "I don't know why I brought it," Yui admitted, her voice barely steady. "I found it while I was packing last month, and I just couldn't leave it behind. Even today." Haruto took the photograph carefully, staring at two people who looked achingly, impossibly young, and said nothing for a long moment, because there was genuinely nothing adequate to say. A knock interrupted them, Kenji, checking in with the patient, easy concern of a genuinely good man who had no idea what he just walked in on. "They think they've almost got it sorted," he said gently, glancing curiously between Yui and the man she was clearly deep in conversation with. "You doing okay?" Yui smiled and told him she was fine, and in a specific way that mattered to the actual wedding schedule for that day. She wasn't entirely lying. Kenji was steady and kind and had never once given her a genuine reason to doubt him. The problem, she realized with a slow, sinking clarity as he left the room again, wasn't Kenji at all. The problem was that somewhere over the last hour, sitting in an accidental waiting room with a man she'd once planned an entire imaginary future with, Yui had felt more genuinely, completely herself than she had in the 18 months since Kenji had gotten down on one knee. Haruto felt something uncomfortably similar settling over him, and it terrified him considerably more than the scheduling disaster ever could. Emi was brilliant, kind, and had built a genuinely happy life alongside him for 2 solid years. But sitting across from Yui, he recognized, with mounting discomfort, the specific and unmistakable difference between a relationship that made sense and a relationship that made him feel entirely, unself-consciously alive. "I need to say something, and I need you to actually let me finish before you respond," Yui said finally, turning to face him directly, her voice steadier than she actually felt underneath it. Haruto nodded, quietly bracing himself. "I love Kenji," she said. "That's true, and it's not going to stop being true just because of the last hour. But I don't think I'm in love with him the way I was in love with you at 20. And I don't think that's fair to him, walking down an aisle today pretending that isn't true." Her voice caught slightly. "I think some part of me has been settling for good enough because good enough felt considerably safer than risking what we had and losing it all over again." Haruto sat with that for a long, quiet moment. "I think I've been doing the exact same thing," he admitted finally. "Building a life that made perfect sense on paper, because the version that actually scared me, the version where I let myself want something this much again, felt like too big a risk to survive losing twice." Neither of them said the obvious thing out loud just yet. That 2 weddings scheduled for the exact same afternoon were both, quite possibly, about to be called off entirely. But the shape of it sat plainly between them now, undeniable and genuinely terrifying in equal measure. Yui thought about the version of that afternoon, where she simply walked back to her dressing room, finished her makeup touch-up, and married Kenji exactly as planned. The version where nothing had to change, where no one had to be hurt, where the scheduling disaster became nothing more than a funny story they'd tell at anniversaries for years to come. It would have been so much easier. It also, she realized with a quiet, sinking certainty, would have been a lie she spent the rest of her life slowly discovering. Haruto thought about the version where he simply returned to his suite, straightened his tie one final time, and walked down the aisle toward Emi exactly as planned. He thought about how easy it would be, how reasonable, how completely unremarkable. And he thought about the specific quiet dread that had been sitting in his chest for months, one he'd been calling nerves because the alternative was too frightening to name. It took the rest of that impossibly long afternoon and several genuinely difficult conversations for either of them to actually act on what had become obvious in that small waiting room. Yui found Kenji first, sitting outside in the venue's garden, and told him, as gently and honestly as she could manage, that she couldn't walk down the aisle that day. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because she owed him a marriage built on more than simply good enough. Kenji, to his enormous credit, didn't argue or beg her to reconsider. He sat with the hurt visibly on his face for a long moment, and after a longer silence, told her he'd rather know the truth in a garden that afternoon than discover it slowly, painfully, years into a marriage neither of them fully meant with their whole hearts. Down the hall, Haruto had his own version of that conversation with Emi, who reacted with a mixture of genuine hurt and, underneath it, a flicker of relief neither of them had expected, an admission, once the initial shock passed, that some quiet part of her had also sensed something missing that she'd simply been too afraid to name out loud until now. By early evening, Sakura Grand Hall hosted no weddings at all that day. 2 carefully planned ceremonies, both called off within hours of each other, for reasons the venue staff would gossip about, in hushed and delighted tones, for months afterward. Yui's mother, who had spent the entire afternoon convinced the venue itself was somehow to blame for ruining her daughter's wedding, took considerably longer to process the real reason once Yui finally explained it to her that evening. There was shock first, then a flash of anger on Kenji's behalf, and finally, after a long walk around the garden together, something closer to reluctant understanding. "I always wondered," her mother admitted quietly, "why you never quite talked about in the way you talked about Haruto all those years ago." Haruto's friends, several of whom had known both him and Yui back in university, greeted the news with a confusing mixture of disbelief and vindication. "I always said you two broke up for the dumbest possible reason," Daichi told him over a drink that night, shaking his head. "Congratulations on finally realizing it. Terrible timing, though. Genuinely one of the worst possible ways to do this." 3 months later, in an apartment near the coast that Yui had bought entirely on her own before any of this happened, Haruto stood in the doorway holding the last of his moving boxes, watching her unpack a photograph from the night market they used to visit every single Friday 6 years earlier. They weren't rushing this time. There was no proposal yet, no ring, no rebooked venue waiting somewhere down the line. Both families needed time to process an afternoon neither of them had fully explained yet, and both Kenji and Emi deserved every bit of the space and grace that difficult honesty had earned them. But Yui and Haruto had agreed on one simple thing, sitting together on that first night in the new apartment. Whatever came next, they would build it slowly, honestly, and without the specific, careless certainty that had once convinced 2 20-year-olds that love alone was enough to survive absolutely anything. They fought, of course, in the small, ordinary ways that any 2 people sharing a kitchen inevitably do. Over whose turn it was to do the dishes, over Haruto's habit of leaving cabinet doors open, over Yui's insistence on rearranging the furniture at least once a month. But this time, when disagreements came, neither of them went quiet the way they once had at 22. They said the uncomfortable thing out loud, sat with the discomfort of it, and found their way back to each other by dinner every single time. 6 months into the new apartment, Haruto finally worked up the nerve to visit the same night market they used to frequent as students, discovering, to his quiet delight, that 4 of the original 6 food stalls were somehow still standing. He brought back photographs to show her, and that evening, they sat together on their new balcony, scrolling through pictures of a market neither of them had visited in 6 years, rebuilding, one small, ordinary ritual at a time, the life they'd once carelessly assumed would simply take care of itself. "So," Haruto said one evening, echoing the exact same nervous half-laugh from that chaotic afternoon in the hallway. "What now?" Yui looked out at the coastline they'd once talked about as an impossible, distant dream, 6 years and one accidental double-booked wedding closing the gap between them. "Now," she said, taking his hand away she had a lifetime ago. We figure out how to actually do it right this time. Not every love story needs a perfect first ending to still be worth telling. Sometimes it just needs two people willing to be honest. Even when honesty arrives in the middle of someone else's wedding day, wearing the wrong dress, standing in the wrong hallway, at exactly the right moment. If you've ever wondered whether it's too late for a second chance, let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Echoes of Us Anime. We bring you a new story just like this every single week.